Well, I guess we can start without the lights. There we go. Thank you all for being here this morning. I'm excited for the study that we have together today. If you have your Bibles, I'd ask that you open them up to John 15. That's where we're going to begin in the text this morning. Before we dive into the study, I've asked Kendall to lead us in a word of prayer.
That you can be with all the teachers and give them a ready remembrance of what they prepared, that we can take it, apply to our lives, and spread your word and grow your kingdom. Thankful for this church, thankful for the hearts here, the ones who are able to help us to always keep each other first and have our eyes fixated on you so that when the end comes, we can hear you say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." In Christ's name, amen.
This quarter, we've used this statement as our purpose statement for the study. The heart is the inner center of our loves and choices. Shaping our lives and following Jesus means continually allowing His heart to form how we love God with our whole being. This is going to continue to serve as our anchor for the study as we finish out the quarter together. And I hope it's been helpful to just pull everything together as we think about this whole being love for God this year and adopting His heart as our own. This week we're going to be in lesson 9 on a sacrificial heart. We're in the transformation section of this study. We're exploring attributes that really push our devotion for God to maybe a deeper level. So last week we focused on prayer. We're thinking about complete dependence upon God, prayer being more than just the words that come out of our mouths, but our posture before Him. Today, we're going to lean into that dependence a little bit more as we think about sacrifice. Now, when I opened up the book again this week and I got to thinking about what we've studied so far, you might be thinking, well, we've hit selflessness. We've talked about compassion, so haven't we already talked about sacrifice? And I think there's an element of that where we could say, yes, we have. But as we think about the life of Jesus and we think about His whole reason for coming, if we went very many weeks without talking about our relationship with other people and how we interact with them, then we may have missed the point of Jesus to begin with. He came from heaven for us, for other people. It was nothing that He needed that brought Him here in the first place. And then as He lived His life on this earth, yes, we saw last week, He's going to take time away from the crowds to pray, to spend time just filling Himself up and in communion with God through prayer. But He always goes back to the crowds. He's back out teaching. He's back out healing. He's constantly out interacting with other people. That's the hallmark of who Jesus is. It's others. It's teaching them. It's bringing them into the kingdom. And so there is a sense in which we've already talked about sacrifice in the other lessons. But I think sacrifice really is going to bring some of these concepts all the way full circle together. Because sacrifice begins with giving up things ourselves for the sake of our service to God. But it does extend to God's people and the world at large as we sacrifice on their behalf to teach, to invite, to bring them to the kingdom as well. So I'm excited for this study. I think it'll be interesting how we see some of this tie together this morning. In John 15, this is one of my favorite texts in the book of John. In John 15, in verse 12. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you so that you will love one another. As we think about Jesus and his whole mission, his purpose for coming, his purpose in calling the apostles, we see a unique group of individuals who he's specifically talking to here. You are my friends. What set them apart as his friends? What does the text tell us? They did his commands. How will we be a friend of Jesus today? You keep his commands. This verse obviously has an immediate context to an immediate audience, but a principle that applies to us. What is he telling his apostles about love? What will love do?
Lay down your life.
Lay down your life. You'll sacrifice. When you think about this idea of laying down your life, there's obviously the important application that Jesus is making as he foreshadows his death. He is laying down his life literally so that we might live. How do we do that today? How can we lay down our lives for others today? Sadie.
Aside from literally laying down someone's life to say, giving our lives, another way to look at that is giving of our time, voluntarily wishing to help those around us, offer assistance, even if it's something small like holding a door open for, say, an elderly couple or a family with small kids, or potentially giving like a ride to someone who needs to get to the hospital quickly, whose car broke down. Small stuff like that could be considered that a kind of sacrifice of giving up of something of yours for someone else.
So leaning into those small daily acts of service. Nelson?
Every moment of Jesus' life was a sacrifice. He set aside something that he was due, that he was owed all the time by all of creation. We could find an example in that. We have to make all of our choices with the consideration of our need to prefer others in our decisions. If we want to show love, if we want to show that we are trying to emulate our Savior, all of the decisions that we make, in them we have to show preference for other people. Now, if there's some fine things to that, right? We're not going to make decisions that are against the will of God. I'm never ever saying that. But we just have to take others into account. We have to take God's glory into account. We have to take into account that we're imitators of Christ. We have to take into account the needs of others before we treat ourselves. We love ourselves.
Thank you. Stephen.
It's something that we can read in Romans 12, which has probably come to other people's minds too, when you talk about presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. So even keeping ourselves holy is part of that sacrifice. Just for keeping ourselves for whatever God's purposes are in our life.
Yeah, I like that phrase, keeping ourselves for God's purposes. That's really good. What over here? How might we be laying down our lives for people, for others today?
I think it's the idea of capacity. It's not the idea of we're operating at 1,000% all the time. Okay, it is to what ends would you go to for your brother? Would you stop at giving them money or a little bit of your time? Is that it? Or if things get tough, would you be there for them? If it required you to go somewhere where they needed help at the risk of your own life, would you do that? Now, we don't operate in lion's den territory all the time, right? We talk about this when we talk about Daniel all the time. Hey, you should be living a life in such a way that when the lion's den shows up, hey, you know, that's the outcome, right? So we're not operating in lion's den territory all the time, but are you living in such a way, and I think this is what Steve was pointing out, are you living in such a way that, should that be the outcome, are you okay with that? And if you're not, then that's what this is talking about right here. The cross was Jesus' lion's den moment.
Also, in 1 Corinthians 9, the sacrifice talks about is that there was a brother who would be stumbling if you did a certain act. And the sacrifice said, well, I know it's fine, but I'm going to sacrifice my will, my doing for the brothers so that they don't stumble and fall away from Christ. That's another way we can sacrifice, is what we hold back from doing so that another brother doesn't stumble.
I think also sometimes we forget that in other parts of the world, people actually are sacrificing their lives for others.
Yeah. Well, to that point, if you hear this comment in the sermon later, just pretend like you didn't hear it in class. I think sometimes we're tempted to read verses like these and wrestle with the question of, would I still confess Jesus if a gun's held to my head, a knife to my throat? If it were actually going to cost me my life, would I be the person to stand up and say, yes, he is my Lord? Because that is what people face in other parts of the world. We're very blessed that that's not the culture that we live in, that that's not something we've had to face here yet. Maybe one day. Maybe the better question for us to think about is, am I willing to give up my preferences, my wants, my desires? I sacrifice those things so that I can live for the Lord today. How much better would it be if everybody who professed to be a Christian thought about how can I sacrifice for God today? How can I live for Him today? That's why I like Romans 12. It's a living sacrifice that we're called to. If we were all called to lay down our lives, there wouldn't be anybody left to spread the gospel. So yes, there is that sense that absolutely, if we're going to take this context and think about what Jesus is doing and what He's calling His apostles to and the fates that they met, absolutely, we should proclaim the gospel even if it costs us our life. That's the pinnacle of love. But what if we were sacrificing our life on a daily basis to live for Jesus, to keep His commands? Zach?
Whenever you look at this statement, it was made before Jesus went to the garden. Peter is, with sword in hand, ready to do exactly this. It's just he didn't understand that, hey, I would die for you is not superior to I would live every day for you. And that's what you're talking about right now, is this idea of this living sacrifice. Day by day, I need you to live for me. And that if it came to it, you would lay down your life. And it just shows a fundamental misunderstanding we have about Peter. Peter heard this phrase and he's like, okay, I'm going to do that. I'll lay down my life for you. They're not going to take you to that cross. And it just shows how important that daily living sacrifice is right there.
Absolutely.
When we think about sacrifice and we think about defining what we're talking about, there's a lot that we could go to. I'm going to suggest it's the intentional willingness to give of ourselves, of our time, of our resources, of our energy, even of our comforts, for the sake of God's purposes and the well-being of others. Now, that's not an all-inclusive list. Obviously, we could put our lives literally up there. Thinking about sacrifice is not a conversation we're having to coerce guilt among other people. Well, you haven't done what I've done. It's not the point at all. And I also want to be clear that this is not a level of unhealthy self-denial. And what I mean by that is we can put ourselves in bad situations that are not required of us. And we're not called to do that. We don't have to do that. So don't hear this lesson and think, well, I got to go on my crusade and get caught up in dangerous, bad situations that aren't necessary. That's something to think about. But on the flip side of this, we've gone back to this word a lot, and it's this idea of posture. This is the posture of a heart that is aligned with God's love. It's choosing the good of others, even when it costs us. We're thinking about others. We're seeing things through God's lens. He wants His kingdom to grow. He wants people to repent. He wants us to be His spokespeople on earth today. We're sacrificing of ourselves so others will hear about Him. So when we think about sacrifice, before we go any further, think about these definitions. What might you add or change or want to make sure we're including as we continue to talk about this morning? Ryan?
Sacrifices are demanded by God. And so it's not just, hey, I'm willing to do X, Y, or Z, but it's something that is approved by God, is demanded by God. Like all these things are totally true, but God requires it of me. It's not optional. How my heart is towards doing that is part of the judgment, but at the same time, there are things that are not sacrifices. Because I say that they are doesn't mean that they are.
I agree. Can you give me an example? Is there something that comes to mind?
I mean, maybe a type of worship. You might be, we talk about song being a sacrifice, lifting, a sweet aroma up to God, with the imagery of the Old Testament, in a cappella music. And if I were to do something that adds to that, is that acceptable to God? No. So is that a worthy sacrifice? No, it's not.
Sure. Yeah, it's offering the sacrifices within the bounds that God's established, and it is demanded by God. Yeah, thank you for that. Brad?
Jesus saying willing to lay down His life for others. It's a volunteering, that's what you're wanting to do. When the Israelites sacrificed animals, they had to be led to the slaughter. When Abraham was going to offer up Isaac was bound. Isaac didn't just go, okay, I'm just going to slay her. No, Isaac was bound and tied up. But to willingly do this and say, okay, I'm going to walk voluntarily to sacrifice. Not necessarily on the cross like Jesus, but we don't have to be led. We don't have to be tied. It's voluntary to do it.
So I put myself on the spot here, and I'm thinking of a passage, and you'll help me find it. I'm sure somebody will. But we think about David, and there's the verse, shall I offer to God that which cost me nothing? David, does anybody know where?
2
let's turn over there real fast. Because I think this is important as we think about sacrifice. The sacrifice isn't it isn't free. Let's see here. So in verse 18 of 2 Samuel 24, and Gad came that day to David and said to him, "Go up, raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." So David went up at Gad's word as the Lord commanded. And when Araunah looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming on toward him. And Araunah went out and paid homage to the king with his face to the ground. And he said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David said, "To buy the threshing floor from you, in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from the people." And he said to David, "Let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this, O king," Araunah gives to the king. And he said to the king, "May the Lord your God accept you." But David said, "No, but I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." It's easy to sacrifice when somebody else is footing the bill. But do we take these principles and actually apply them to us? I will not offer to God that which costs me nothing. Right?
But this Jebusite was a foreigner. He was not even a Jew. It was also one of the groups that Joshua was told to destroy. He could have said, "God told us to destroy these people. Hey, I want this land. I'm going to kill you because God told us to take that land." But he did not.
Yeah, so there's definitely some historical context to consider. Stephen?
Ryan had talked about it not being optional, and that's true. It's not optional. But then there's also been talk about it being free will. We give voluntarily. So I think one of the principles set forth in 2 Corinthians 8 about just sacrificing their means to help brethren in Jerusalem, of course, Paul was encouraging the brethren of Corinth by basically shaming them because the Macedonian brethren had given beyond their poverty level. I mean, they gave beyond what they really could. But Paul didn't tell them you have to give the same degree as the Macedonians. He said, just do what you committed to do. So they chose, but they didn't fulfill what they said they were going to do. They didn't have to be at the same level of poverty to put themselves in poverty. He actually encouraged them, don't become impoverished, helping others. You help them when you have abundance, they help you when you have abundance. It's more about equality. But who decides what that equality is? There's some judgment in there. So I think there's also a level of growth. As we mature as a Christian, we realize the depth of sacrifice that we should be making, and we do better. It's something we can learn to do better and better over time. It's not an on-off switch where we go, oh yeah, I can do. I mean, you could tell David, hey, you should have given a lot more for that threshing floor. Sure. But he chose what he was going to buy it for. So there's a little bit of both in there, at least as far as I can tell. I would never judge someone harshly for their level of decision making on what they have that they're willing to part with and sacrifice of their time and energy. And I don't know their circumstance either, just like you wouldn't judge me. So there's a level of that in there as well, I think.
So the comments that we've heard so far, so it's something that's demanded by God. It's an expectation that He lays out. But then we've been talking really about the individual responsibility of it. This is a I sacrifice for God, and I'm not held to your standard of sacrifice. You're not held to mine. And if we take the 2 Corinthians principle, a lot of that comes down to what we've committed to sacrifice. Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about all of this, and we think about this in relationship to what Jesus taught about sacrifice, there were 3 passages that we considered in this section, Mark chapter 8, where Jesus talks about, again, self-denial, taking up the cross. There's John chapter 10, where Jesus describes himself as the good shepherd. Let's go to John chapter 10 for a minute, because I think there's an interesting contrast that's made here, something that we can certainly learn from. In John chapter 10, Jesus is going to talk about his sheep. He's going to talk about himself and his role and what sets himself apart specifically as the good shepherd. In John chapter 10 and verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So if we pause right there, this is before John 15, I understand that. But he's then going to extend this to his apostles. Greater love is not anything more than this. It's laying down life. So he's consistent in his teaching. In verse 12, he who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up. This charge I have received from my Father. What's the difference between the shepherd and a hired hand?
The shepherd cares. The shepherd wants to make sure that the sheep are in good hands and good covered. The hireling will just leave the sheep to die, to feed for themselves. And he makes that plain and clear in his passage.
What motivates the hired hand? Money. What's in it for me? I don't really care about the sheep, exactly what you're saying. I just want my paycheck. But at the end of the day, if that's going to cost me my life, not worth it. When we think about Jesus laying down his life, what is he teaching us about his sacrifice that's coming?
It's for those who belong to him.
It's for those who belong to him. What else?
That we made a choice.
Have the power, have the authority to lay it down. What else?
It was his life purpose. And so you said the difference between a shepherd and a hired man. One is this is my life, and the other is I just work here.
It's his whole purpose. Wade?
Sometimes it's easier to fight and die for a cause that you believe in than to submit to the will of God. And I think that's kind of what Jesus is saying there in John chapter 15. And Peter's listening to this. Well, later, Peter in the garden picks up a sword. He's ready to fight and die for something he believes in. When Jesus told him to put the sword down, he was confused. And it's like, he wasn't sure how to, well, what do we do now? And Jesus said, you sacrifice yourself. That was what he was willing to do. Peter's like, I don't understand. And it wasn't until later that he understood what that meant. But John 15, he keeps talking about the motivating factor is love. It's not going on a crusade. The motivating factor is love. And John, again, in his first letter, says, perfect love casts out fear. So fear is the thing that keeps us from sacrificing a lot of times. He says, if you've got enough love, you're not going to have any fear. And that was what Jesus was trying to communicate here, that if you have enough love, there's no place for the fear.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Brad?
According to some of the Orthodox Jewish people I've talked to, the sacrificial system of the Old Testament is where you make a choice between the physical items and a relationship with God. Are you willing to give up, which could be 30 to 40% of your gross, to have a relationship with God? If the answer is no, you're not going to have you're not going to make the sacrifice. So you're not going to do what God says and have a relationship. Jesus is doing what God wants. He's doing His will. And if it means sacrifice Himself, He will.
I like thinking through those things because when we think about the Old Testament, we think about the very specific numbers. We think about the percentage, 10%. We think about measuring exactly what you're supposed to give in spices. And we want to sometimes I say we, I just mean professing Christians at large, want to overbind those examples when we get all the way into the New Testament and we see the widow and her 2 mites. And I don't think we can escape what David said. I offer to God that which cost me nothing. It could be easy to sit there and live our lives thinking, okay, if I need to give God 30% or 40% or 10%, then, I need to make this much money because I'm going to be able to still support my lifestyle that I want to support. And so if I make, even more money and I get this box checked, I'm going to have enough left. And we can reverse engineer all this stuff to really make it not much of a sacrifice. And I think that's what's so special about the sacrifices in the New Testament, because it's not about the measurement, it's not about the percentage. It's about committing to God and following through. It's about giving to God everything. He doesn't need my money, but He still wants me to give. He doesn't need me to be a preacher. He just needs me to serve Him. He wants me to serve Him. And that's the same for all of us. When we think about John chapter 10, one of the phrases that I think stands out to me the most is verse 18. No one takes it from me. He's going to be murdered. He's going to be killed at the hands of other people. Yet his perspective is, nobody takes it from me. Now we can think about how that logically plays out. I could call 12 legions of angels, Peter, but I'm not going to. I could deliver myself from this. I don't have to be subjected to that. But I will. I'm going to choose to. When we think about how Jesus taught about sacrifice, he's making a distinction in this passage about, really, I think if we want to get really specific here, he's making a distinction between him and the leaders of the people that day. You don't see the Pharisees wanting to go lay down their lives for the Jews. No, they're out making concessions with the Roman government. They're trying to figure out, how can we go along to get along? How can we make this work for now? Hoping the Messiah will come and solve all our problems. It was about somebody else taking care of the issues. So there's probably an immediate application to some of the people there, and he's calling them hired hands. But just a few chapters later, not very long, not much time has passed, he's telling the apostles, the way that I am the good shepherd to the sheep, the care I have for the sheep, I want you to have that same love for the sheep. And if we're going to extend that then to us, he wants us to have that same love for the sheep. And so I think this is not meant to be an exclusive, this is who I am. But we see how his teaching brings all of this together. We are called to sacrifice and to show love and care for the sheep the same way he did. And one other note on this, verse 16. I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also. What's he talking about? Gentiles. We're going to have one big flock. Is Jesus going to be here in the body on earth inviting Gentiles into the flock? No. We see the apostles extending that to the Gentiles. That's our job. To continue to share Jesus, to bring those around us into his flock. And to do that, to be effective in doing that, we have to care about the sheep, regardless of what it costs us. When we think about how Jesus lived this, we've all talked about this already, but I want to go forward because we've talked about this a few times. We've talked about other scriptures supporting Jesus' teaching. Go to Matthew 26 with me. We brought up Peter in the garden. This is here in the text. I think this is really interesting. When we think about what's happening here in Matthew 26 as Jesus goes to the garden, before he's ever betrayed, he's praying. What are his apostles doing? Why? It's the middle of the night. So sometimes we look at this and it's easy to kind of remove ourselves and point the finger at what they're doing. How dare they? It's the middle of the night. They're exhausted. Jesus is also exhausted, but he's praying. In verse 47, 46, Jesus tells his apostles, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Now, I've never been to Jerusalem. I've not seen this, but I've seen some like documentary type things of this. In the garden, Jesus likely sees them coming the whole way. So he's not surprised. It's dark. They have torches. Like, they're going to be seen coming from the city to the garden. Jesus has every opportunity to say, guys, wake up. We got to go. We got to get out of here. But he sees them coming. While he was still speaking in verse 47, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Before we even get to Peter, what does Jesus call Judas? Friend. The same Judas who heard these words in John 15, "You are my friend if you do what I command you." How often are we hurt by other people and our temptation, our gut reaction is to say unkind things about them? To maybe speak harshly to them. Jesus is being betrayed, but he calls his betrayer friend. Think about the weight of that. What does Judas feel hearing those words come out of Jesus' mouth? Maybe nothing? I don't know. What does he do after this? He gives the money back. Can you imagine just that like knife to the chest, like, whew. Judas is betraying Jesus, and Jesus calls him friend. Judas goes back, I can't take this money. I've just given up my friend. You see the opportunity that Jesus is giving Judas? Does Jesus still love Judas? The answer should be a resounding yes. He does. And we find ourselves in Judas' position, whether we're not the ones going into the garden kissing him, betraying him in that way, but we betray our relationship with him. When we sin, we betray our relationship with Jesus. Yet he continues to love us, to care for us, to provide us with opportunity to do what's right. So we think about what happens to Judas after he returns the money. What does he do? He hangs himself. He missed the opportunity. Jesus laid it out as he's being betrayed. I still care about you. And Judas missed the whole point. But as we continue in the text of what's happening here, we see that they came up, they laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so?" At that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. What do you feel when you read those words?
Like I feel. That's what I feel. Humble.
Feel guilt. Because if you put yourself in those shoes, you're thinking, well, I wouldn't have done that. It's like, well, wouldn't you though? Like, we can say what we want to say, but at that point, it's just, when your entire worldview is, here is your general, your priest, and your king, who is going to overthrow all of these filthy Gentiles, drive out all of these pagans, restore this Davidic kingdom, and usher in a golden age again that will never end. And then he's being led to an unfair trial to be killed. I mean, they are probably going, do we have the wrong guy? Like, is this real? Is this happening? We believe he is who he says he is, but now we don't know what's happening. So you can see the sheer confounding that they have going on right here, where their worldview is being shattered in front of them. And for me to think that I would do any better is the height of hubris.
I was just thinking about how when we think about all these disciples and the confidence they had in Jesus and all the miraculous things they had seen Jesus do, it doesn't say explicitly, but you might think that these disciples were expecting, and Judas himself may have been expecting, that when these people came out against Jesus, that Jesus would demonstrate his power. You know, the Jews had been looking for a long time for this Messiah to overcome those who
were oppressing them as Romans. And so perhaps that was on their mind. And we can be tempted to think that way as well, that if we're living the way Christ would have us to live, that Christ is just going to make things just the way we think they ought to be in this life. That's our expectation. We may not say it that way, but it's kind of in the back of our mind, and that's demonstrated when things don't go the way we expected them to go or the way we want them to go. And instead of continuing to follow Christ, we choose a different path. We forsake him like the disciples did. So it's much like what Zach said. There's that tinge of guilt you feel when you read about these disciples forsaking Jesus, and you go back and you think, have I done that?
Can you imagine how confused the disciples probably felt? Didn't cross my mind when I was studying for the class, so again, I should have the reference, but I don't. But wasn't it Jesus who told them to take up their swords in the first place? So take them up, but not use them? Now, I don't think there's some big hidden point behind that regarding us today. But can you imagine being them? The people coming against them have swords and clubs. They're arresting Jesus, and Jesus said, no, put that up. We're not here to fight. By the way, don't you know that I can call on my Father to send me 12 legions of angels and all this would be over? Do it! You won't let us fight, so call on God and fight. But his sacrifice led to them, we got to get out of here. So when we think about Jesus and his sacrifice, he went through it alone. Number one, nobody else was going to stand alongside him, say, well, take me too, though Peter said he would. He's out with the rest of them. He's going to look at his betrayer and call him friend. He's going to show care to the people who were actively torturing him. And we're going to see that continue through the story. And he's going to do that as far as the flesh is concerned in no way that benefits himself. But he does it anyway. When we think about what Jesus shows us and what he teaches about sacrifice, there's so much that we could say that we haven't this morning. But I want to get to, for just a moment, I want to take the next few seconds. We have 2 minutes left in class. And I want us to think about sacrifice in our life. I'm sure some in this room are really good at deciding to sacrifice for the Lord and following through on it. And I'm just as sure that there are probably some of us, myself at times included, who struggled to follow through. Reflect for just a few seconds. What is it that you're succeeding at with sacrifice? And where could we do better? I'm inclined to believe that no two answers would be identical if we went around the room and started sharing. I ask you to reflect on that this week, as well as this. There's one practical way this week, as we go out of here today, that we can actively choose sacrifice in the week ahead. Does anybody have an idea they would like to share? Zach?
When you have kids, they will break things, and sometimes it's stuff. And I will sometimes think, if I didn't have this anymore, like let's say something got spilled on a computer keyboard or something like that. If I didn't have this anymore, would that be the end of my life? And the answer is a resounding no, of course not. And so, starting to detach from covetous thoughts is a sacrificial attitude will do. It is the opposite. It is the antithesis of covetousness. You can't be covetous and sacrificial at the same time. And so, just operating in a mindset of, at any point, is this something that I just need? No, be content then with what you've got, because that then opens the doors wide open for me to then look to the needs of someone else and to see how I can best help them out. So that's just something that I catch myself doing. Is this something I need? No? All right, then be content, because then it's open.
Thank you for that.
Next week, we're going to be in Lesson 10 on having a courageous heart. Thank you all for participating in the conversation this morning.